So this is lecture 1 of the 8-part series by Rabbi Lawrence Troster, Rashi, His World, and the Origin of Ashkenazic Jews. And today we're going to look at the origin and background of Ashkenaz, but I want to begin, first of all, why is Rashi so important? Rashi is important for a number of reasons. First of all, he's probably the most studied Jewish source from the Middle Ages, probably even more than Maimonides, in that his commentary to the Torah to this day is considered to be the most basic in traditional circles, the most basic introduction to studying the Torah. Children begin studying the Torah with Chumash, with Rashi. And in fact, Rashi, as you will see, his commentary to the Torah is he has his own, obviously there's a lot of him in it, but also it's a real opening to the rabbinic literature. So if you want to know what the Talmudic rabbis thought the meaning of a verse was, Rashi is the one who tells you that, and it's therefore an introduction into that whole literature. And so for traditional Jews, the Torah is understood through the lens of Rashi. That's different, of course, from modern Bible commentary, which looks at, ancient languages and tries to understand it as it was written. So that's one of the reasons why he's been so important and so influential, that his commentary became kind of, the foundation of a lot of other biblical commentary. And within a relatively short time after his death, the commentary became quite popular, and it was one of the very first Jewish book to be printed. That we have a date on the printing from the late 15th century is Rashi's commentary to the Torah. There are some other earlier printed books, but there's no date on them, and we're not even quite sure where they were printed. So that's the other thing. The second thing, of course, is Rashi does pretty much the same thing for the Talmud, that without Rashi, it's in some cases, it's difficult to understand what the Talmud is saying. And so Rashi, in effect, tells us how to read the Talmud. And of course, the caveat there is it's his reading. Okay, and we'll get into what that means. But again, most people understand when they study the Talmud, study it with Rashi, and therefore understand the Talmud through the lens of Rashi. And the third way in which Rashi is important is just his physical lineage. He married off his daughters to some of his most important students, and they themselves, a couple of them, several of his grandsons became really important Talmudic scholars. And so he was, although he was part of a already established network of scholars, he didn't pop out of nothing. He, in effect, his descendants physically created a whole school of Talmudic learning, the Tosafos, as well as the dynasties of most of the major rabbinical families of Europe. If you go into Jewish family tree research, you will see that all the great rabbinical families of Central and Eastern Europe and even Italy are all interrelated, and most of them end up being descendants from Rashi. And of course, there is a traditional claim that Rashi was descended from King David, which is not true, but people then say, well, if you're a descendant of Rashi, you're a descendant of King David. But the point is, there are family trees that are published, and many of these family trees, in fact, were based on trees that were made up, drew up in the Middle Ages and later by these rabbinical families, because that was the yichus was important to them. And so that's quite interesting in itself. So Rashi also exemplifies the rise of Ashkenazic Jewry, the culture of Ashkenaz, because he is both an exemplar of that culture, but also he's a very critical moment in the development of that culture, as you will see. So that's why he's so important. He's not a philosopher like Maimonides. He knew Hebrew grammar, but not as well as the Spanish Jews of Ibn Ezra. As the scientific study of Hebrew grammar that went on in Spain long before him. He shows knowledge of a lot of traditional sources, but he doesn't. He doesn't read Arabic, so he doesn't know the whole Jewish philosophical tradition that was evolving in Spain and elsewhere. But he of course has the Talmud, and he has all kinds of other sources, and as a result, he's a really critically important figure and worthy of study. And it's, as I mentioned before we started the recording, it's too bad that nobody's done an anthology of his writing to include beyond his Torah commentary in English, because in addition to his Talmudic commentaries, he wrote commentaries on many of the other books of the Hebrew Bible, not all of them. He didn't actually write commentaries on all books of the Talmud, but almost all of them. And he wrote rabbinical responsa because he was a leader. He wasn't just an academic or a head of a yeshiva. He was actually a communal leader. So we have his rabbinical responsa, as well as his ordinances, his takanot, as they're called, and we'll talk more about that at another time, and some liturgical stuff, because he had an impact on the development of the Ashkenazic liturgy, as opposed to the Sephardic liturgy, because it was precisely in his time that split in the liturgy was occurring. And in fact, one of his, somebody who was part of his school, created what was the very first Ashkenazic prayer book, the Machzor Vitri, in a century or two after him. So he had an enormous influence, and this is the reason why it's important to study. And anybody have any questions or anything at this particular point? Okay, good. So I want to start with a couple of terminology issues.
You will talk about that split between the Ashkenaz and Sephardic liturgy?
Maybe a little bit. Maybe when we get to it.
So until then, it's all like the 9th century.
Well, it's everybody's basically basing their Siddur on Rav Amram Gaon's Siddur, and you're getting local cultural stuff. But you really, in the time of Rashi, begin to see the very distinct liturgical separation between Sephardi and Ashkenazi, because going on. Okay. Anybody have any other questions at this point?
You'll get to what Ashkenaz means.
Yes, I will get to what Ashkenaz means. So I want to talk about the thorny issue of what do we mean when we say the Middle Ages, and what do we mean when we say the Jewish Middle Ages. The people in the Middle Ages didn't know they were living in the Middle Ages. The term was a derisive term that was actually, I think, developed during the Renaissance precisely to claim that there was this period of time that was, they were arising out of the often called the Dark Ages, again, a term that no historian uses anymore, from the great classical period and the great Renaissance, and there's this period in the middle. So when do the Middle Ages, we still use it as a term of time, when did it start is all a question on who's writing and what are your criteria for the beginning of the Middle Ages. And there isn't necessarily a firm date. Yeah.
I think of feudalism synonymous with the Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, that's one part of it, and aspects of feudalism predate what we call the Middle Ages and postdate it. So it's not, if we want to look at some dates, some people talk about the fall of the Roman West in the 5th century with the barbarian invasions. But people tend to now call this the late classical period now. Probably, do we talk about the rise of the Muslim Empire in the 7th century? That's probably a pretty good rough period to talk about, because you'll see the idea of the fall of the Roman West. There was a lot of continuity in the West between the Roman Empire and the kingdoms that followed it in many, many places. We'll get to that. And when does the Middle Ages end? I mean, when does the Renaissance begin? It depends on which country you're talking about, and is it it's a very sticky thing to try and pin down.
What cultural area you're talking
Exactly, and it tends to be very Eurocentric and doesn't take into account the Muslim Empire, and of course we're only talking about the Mediterranean basin and Europe, and let's forget about the East completely on that. When you get to the notion of the Jewish Middle Ages, this is also just as difficult. The destruction of the first and second temples are pretty hard and fast dates. When do we call what's the beginning of the Middle Ages? Well, traditionally, very often people have said the editing of the Talmud, which Talmud? Okay, so the Babylonian Talmud is usually ascribed around 500 CE, but we know now that's probably too early. It probably was still being edited for a couple of centuries after that. And I think really, and of course, when does the Jewish Middle Ages end? Some people make the claim that it doesn't end until the 18th century, which is absurd. So here's what I'm going to say, based on my own studying with some good scholars about this many years ago, that one of the things that we should look at is centers of demographic centers. Demographic centers really tell you a lot about what's periods of time. So if we want to look at what is often referred to as the early Middle Ages, or again sometimes the Dark Ages, from around 500 to around the year 1000, the vast majority of Jews are living in the East. 90% of Jews in the world are living in the Muslim empires or in kingdoms, and the vast majority of them are living in the East, in Iraq, Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, Israel, and North Africa. That's where most of them live. There are very few in the West, relatively speaking. Not that there haven't been Jews in the West. We know that there's ample evidence for Jews living throughout the Mediterranean basin during the time of the Roman Empire. The only place where we don't have direct evidence for Jews living in the Roman Empire is Britain. There are either documentary evidence or archaeological evidence for Jews living in every other part of the Roman Empire. We know that in the West there were Jewish settlement areas, usually around towns and cities that housed were the headquarters of Roman legions. There was even evidence for Jews living on the border in Germany, in Cologne. There's been some archaeological evidence. But there are no major Jewish centers in the West. We know there were Jews in Spain, but not much evidence before the 5th century. The place where we know that Jews definitely lived is in Italy, especially in Rome. There was a long-established Jewish community, probably from the time of Julius Caesar, from the 1st century BCE, and other centers in Italy, and especially in southern Italy. We know Jews, of course, were in North Africa, and in southern France. But there's not much else. There are places where there are Jews, but there's not. The documentation is relatively, and archaeological is relatively meager until you get a little later, and that's going to be important. What happens is that in the 10th century, you're beginning to see a demographic shift from the East, with more and more significant Jewish centers developing in what was the old Western Roman Empire. Not only larger populations in Italy and southern France, but Spain becomes a major Jewish center, especially after the Muslim conquest. There were Jews there during the Visigothic period, and the community was developing, but Spain becomes a major Jewish center with the Muslim conquest in the 8th century, early 8th century, North Africa for sure. And as you will see, you begin to see the settlement of Jews in what we now call northern France and the Rhineland in Germany, and after the Norman conquest in England, but that's much later. So the Jewish Middle Ages in the West really, in some ways, is a demographic shift. But population numbers are still relatively small. That's the one thing you have to remember. It takes quite a while for them to build up. So that's really what we're looking at. We're going to be looking at this early period in Northern Europe, primarily what we call today France and Germany, because that's the and Italy as well, because that's really where Ashkenaz begins. Yeah.
Before this time, would you say the Jews or Israelites lived mostly in the Israeli area, in the area around Israel and Mesopotamia? And then after
From the time of the Babylonian exile, you have a significant community in Mesopotamia, and with the development of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the 4th century BCE, you have the beginning of a widespread diaspora. So during the Roman Empire, there is a widespread diaspora, but the big communities are in Mesopotamia, which is outside the Roman Empire most of the time, Syria, Eretz Yisrael, Egypt. Those are the big centers of Jewish life.
So would you say the diaspora was mainly forced, or was it also voluntary?
Oh, most of it was completely voluntary. It may have had its origin in some forced migrations, but Jews willingly settled in all kinds of areas around the Roman Empire for the same reason anybody else did. And when you have an empire, by the way, it usually means that travel is facilitated. I mean, that's one of the ways. The reasons why the Jews in the Muslim Empire were able to get around so much, because it was quite safe to do so, relatively speaking, and of course because of the Muslim Hajj, that encouraged a lot of people to move around a lot, and of course trade is incredibly important. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why Jews end up, by the way, in Northern and Central Europe, is because of trade. So again, during the late Roman Empire, they are centered around places in what is now the former Yugoslavia. There were Jewish centers there around towns and cities that grew up around the military headquarters of the legions stationed there, and that's probably how they ended up in Cologne as well, because that was the border of the Roman Empire, and Cologne was one of the major military headquarters for the Roman army. So.
Do you think the late Roman Empire went until 400 or 500 or beyond that?
Well, the Western Empire technically fell apart in the 5th century and was replaced by what we refer to as the barbarian kingdoms. But as you will see, there was a lot of continuity with what went on in the Roman Empire in terms of administration and other things. Again, we tend to think of wars as being really big points, but very often, transitions take a long period of time, longer than we normally think that they do, as you will see. So we are really looking at the development of Ashkenaz is part and parcel of the development of these new Jewish centers in the West. And Ashkenaz and Sfarad, Spain, become the two major Jewish centers in the West by the 11th century. And they just continue to grow. And one of the reasons why they begin to develop is in the 11th century, you have the return to urban life in the West. One of the things that happened with the fall of the Western Roman Empire is the decline of cities. And that, for several centuries, that is pretty much the case. But in the 11th century, you begin to see the growth again of larger urban centers. And with that, you see the growth of these communities in Ashkenaz.
What's the other one? Ashkenaz?
Sfarad, the Sephardic Jews in Spain. So, where does the name Ashkenaz come from? That's a matter of debate among scholars, but it seems to be based on the same thing happened with Sfarad, by the way, and Sarfat, which is the name eventually given to France. Ashkenaz is mentioned as the name of a descendant of Japhet, one of the sons of Noah, in chapter 10 of Genesis, verse 3. The descendants of Gomer, who was the son of Japhet, are Ashkenaz, Rifas, and Togarmah. Now, Ashkenaz in this case probably refers to some ethnic group living in somewhere in northern Mesopotamia. But for some reason, this word, and it's used, this group is mentioned a couple of other times in the Tanakh, got associated with the Roman province of Germania. Okay? All right? In other words, what the Roman, what we call today Germany didn't exist. There were all these Germanic tribes, and the Romans had two provinces on the Rhine that were Greater and Lesser Germania. Okay, and in fact, the Romans are the ones that gave the name to the whole area, Germany. I mean, the Germans don't call themselves Germans. They call themselves the Deutsch. But anyway, Germania got associated with, they used the term Ashkenaz to associate it with Germania. Now, why did they do that?
Who did?
We don't know.
We don't know who did.
There may be because there was a similarity to a tribe that is related to the same root of the word Scandinavia, Skandnaz. Okay, there's a number of linguistic theories. We don't know, and it didn't happen right away. In other words, there's a reference to Germania in the Talmud that associates it with Ashkenaz, but generally the term Ashkenaz did not get really completely used until a little later. And at first, it really did apply to the whole area of north of the Alps, the Rhine Valley, and some parts to the east, and what we call today the whole northern France. That was sort of a general term for Ashkenaz. But by the 11th century already, they were making distinctions that Ashkenaz was Germania proper, and Sarfat was being used for France. Okay? So, but today we use the term to mean anybody who is a descendant of Jews from Central and Eastern Europe as a large cultural sphere. Next week I'll tell you a little bit about the origin of the Ashkenaz language, which becomes Yiddish. But the roots of that are actually quite interesting. But that when we mean Ashkenaz today, we are talking about anybody who is descendant from Jews whose origin comes from Eastern Europe or Central Europe, and dating back to the Middle Ages from the Rhineland. And the Rhine is really the heart of Ashkenaz. The Rhine Valley is the heart of what we call Ashkenaz. Let's take a look at some of the geographic influences. So if you look at page 2 of what I've given you, you'll see there a map from a fascinating book on the impact of Talmud study in the West. And the author points out something really interesting, that when you take a look at the geographical divisions in, as you see, what is France and the Low Countries and Western Germany, you see a cultural divide based upon geography. That the area to the south, okay, which is south of the Loire, this is where the Roman influence lasted a long time. Namely, a literate culture where documents, written documents, were signs of authenticity, legal documents, the use of Latin. This is where the Latinate culture long remained after the fall of the Roman West. All right? So legal transactions had to be written. Now, when you look north of the Loire, as you see, it includes Brittany, what we call today, Normandy, and the whole area over there. This is where, and again, these are areas that are geographically separated from one another by plateaus and river valleys. This is the Germanic area where things were oral. There were long traditions where the only legitimate thing was oral oaths and visual rituals that became parts of legal actions. And these, and it is this northern part where Ashkenaz develops. The southern part is not. And that's very important, by the way, also later on in terms of the differences in cultural differences between Jews of southern France and the Jews of northern France, who are really in the Ashkenazic sphere. Okay, so I just recently saw this book within the last few weeks, and it's quite interesting, because in the early Ashkenaz you don't have a literate culture that depends on documents, but on oral stuff and on rituals. And there are certain distinct Ashkenazic rituals that are based on this culture. So they reflected the culture of the place they lived in. Okay? There was a whole, you may have heard of the famous, ritual of when a little boy is about to begin studying Torah, giving them, cookies in the shapes of the Aleph Beit, or having the Aleph Beit written on a board covered in honey, and they're supposed to. That is a very, very ancient ritual. The ritual of when a male child is about to study Torah. This goes back really early in Ashkenazic history. There's a whole book written about this ritual. And there's all kinds of other aspects of it and variations on it that you haven't heard of and people don't do anymore. So that's one of the most important things that we have to understand. That early Ashkenaz was an oral culture primarily, like the surrounding Germanic culture. Interestingly enough, when I talked earlier about Rashi being a watershed, it is precisely around the time of Rashi that the Ashkenazic culture is shifting to a literate, document-oriented culture, as the Germanic were the same time. And it's one of the reasons why we have so little documentation for the early period, because they just wasn't there. They didn't write things down. And so Rashi's part of a whole revolution, so to speak, both culturally, generally culturally, and Jewishly, in the shift from a culture that primarily relies on oral rituals, oral traditions, to one that relies more on textual things. And once you have something in a text, it becomes a lot less fluid and a lot more fixed. Okay? So it's really quite interesting. By the way, this book has caused a lot of controversy in Jewish scholarly circles, but it seems quite reasonable to me.
This shift was gradual in both areas?
Where?
In northern and southern?
No, southern was already literate. That's the point. Southern had the literate culture, where if you were transacting a legal action, you had to have a document. This is in the general courts. North, they didn't trust documents. It had to be oaths, witnesses, that kind of thing. Okay, so the other thing, of course, is the legal status of the Jews, and here's where there's a fair bit of documentation dating back quite early. You have a lot of references to Jews in church documents throughout this entire so-called period of the Dark Ages, where previous codes from the Eastern Roman Empire and the late Roman Empire, when the empire became Christian, about Jews are passed on to the West and are written into various codes of various kinds of things. Again, just because something's written in a text or a law code doesn't mean it was actually followed. But you also begin to see the mention of Jews in documents. Both church documents and secular documents, and what it seems is that the Jews were given, individual Jews were given various rights of settlement under the Carolingian kings, and then what happens later on is you get a much more formalized legal status through the use of charters by whoever's ruling particular towns, and we'll look at one of them later. But there's ample evidence that prior to the First Crusade, the Jews were treated fairly tolerantly. There weren't a lot of them. And moving on to economics, they seem to be primarily involved in long-distance trade. We have evidence from a Muslim source of a group called the Radhanites, who are Jews, who are traveling all over the eastern Mediterranean into northern Europe and even into Eastern Europe, trading spices, slaves, anything that was movable back and forth, long distance trading. What happens is that kind of trade amongst the Jews decline, and you get a lot more, as this period goes on, you get a lot more localized economic activity, and eventually, of course, you get into the whole area of money lending. But originally, the Jews who settled in these areas were part and parcel of international trading networks. And it probably was the case that some of these communities were established as kind of local branches of trading families. Mm-hmm. And we'll actually see one family migration to show you how that happens. The other thing, of course, is that Ashkenaz forms in the period we're talking about at the same time of the Carolingian Empire, which brings together the whole northern half of Italy into a unified empire with everything that we now call France, the Low Countries, and Germany, fairly far to the east, not really far to the east. And so if you want to take a look on page 3, you'll see there, and I'm sorry, the color is, I couldn't make it, but you see at the time of Charlemagne, you see how big his empire was. Okay, in other words, it goes all the way over to Spain, covers everything that we call France and the Low Countries, and the whole northern half of Italy, because the southern half of Italy is ruled by the Byzantines. Okay, at one point, the Byzantines conquered southern Italy during the time of Justinian, and for hundreds of years, the whole southern half of Italy and Sicily was under the control of the Byzantines. That's important. But so the early period of the development of Ashkenaz is in the Carolingian Empire, and because the Carolingians controlled Italy and the Alps and the passes through the Alps, this facilitated the movement of Jews from Italy into the Rhine Valley. So if you take a look on page 4, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about.
What's the origin of the Carolingian?
Well, that's, you'll see.
Okay.
So when we look at the migrations of Jews from Italy into the north, this is pretty much where you have it, where Jews from Rome, Livorno, Genoa, Marseille, Avignon, Venice, Ravenna, and a very important center that's not included in here, Lucca, which is in Tuscany, was a very important Jewish center. They begin migrating through the various passes and river valleys, you see, through the Alps and the Rhone. And this is where they end up in the heartland of Ashkenaz, in the Rhine Valley, in the cities of Mainz, Worms, and Speyer.
What is it that facilitates them going north? I missed that.
Trade, and the fact that this is a unified empire. Okay, so a lot of trade because Italy was, of course, the way in which you got to the Eastern Mediterranean, and the connection with because even though there was a division between Muslims and Christians and there was fighting going on, there was always trade. Okay, there was always trade. And so all of these communities are places, the map says centers of Jewish settlement about 500. Some of those are kind of speculative, I am going to definitely say, but not the ones in Italy, no, not the southern ones, but definitely by the year 1000, which you see all of these towns have Jewish communities. The ones to the east are, much smaller. The central ones are the Rhine communities of Mainz, Speyer, and Worms. And what this doesn't show is that community goes, like if you look where it says France, into what we now call the province of Champagne and the northern provinces of France and Normandy, what becomes Normandy. That's where they move into that part, and then with the conquest of England by the Normans, they move into England. So that's kind of how things moved. But you'll notice, therefore, that Ashkenaz begins in Italy. And that's important to understand. Where did the Italian Jews come from? Well, they've been there for a very long time. But some of them came from southern Italy. Some of them actually came from the Greek-speaking, because southern Italy, the Byzantine part, was mostly Greek-speaking for a long, long, long time, dating back to the ancient Greek colonies in southern Italy, like Syracuse and in Sicily and places like that. So you see, southern Italy is really a Greek-speaking area to a great extent, and northern Italy, of course, is what becomes Italian. Okay, so I talked about urbanization, so let's just take a look at the timeline, because Sam asked about the Carolingians. So this is a little bit, I didn't give you a lot of details, and I didn't put any Jewish stuff in here, what happens is that in the early 8th century, in 711, is when the Muslims invade Spain, overthrow the Visigoths, and very quickly take over most of the Iberian Peninsula, and even pushes into what we call now southern France. In other words, parts of what is now Aquitaine, and the area in Tours and places like that, were occupied by the Muslims for several decades. What happens is that in 732, Charles Martel, who is the predecessor of the Carolingian Empire, he defeats the Muslims in the Battle of Tours and pushes the Muslims back into Iberia, and the border area of the Pyrenees between what is now France and what is Spain is called the Spanish March, and is the area where the confrontation between Christianity and Islam continues for quite a while. There are times when what we call Catalonia, Barcelona, is under Christian occupation, and sometimes it's under Muslim occupation. But in 751, Pepin the Short founds what we call the Carolingian dynasty. In other words, there are previous dynasties ruling over what we call today France and parts of Germany, but it's the Carolingians that we are primarily concerned with. And one of the other critical points is that Pepin gives the Pope temporal power over central Italy. So that's the beginning of what become called the Papal States, where the Pope now actually has physical temporal power, including armies and things like that. And this is going to have a huge impact on later history, both for Italy and for the Church. Charlemagne begins to rule in 768, and of course Charlemagne just means Charles the Great. And what's critical is that in the year 800, he is crowned Holy Roman Empire. He claims the status of being a Christian Roman emperor, and this begins the formal start of what is called the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire, in one form or another, lasts all the way till the time of Napoleon, when it's finally dissolved, and often refers to a whole bunch of states, independent principalities that make up modern Germany and the Low Countries, and originally Burgundy and parts of Italy. And there eventually becomes this system of various rulers become what are called electors, who are the group that elect who is going to be the Holy Roman Emperor. And during the Middle Ages, this actually has some real meaning. Later on, it becomes an honorific. Charlemagne dies in 814. And by the way, Charlemagne's capital is now the city of Aachen in Germany. And a piece of personal family history, the town that my wife's family came from, Lorsch, was founded by Charlemagne in 1250 years ago with an abbey in the town of Lorsch. That is, parts are still there. It's one of the pieces of Carolingian architecture that still exists. And there are interesting pieces of Carolingian architecture and buildings that still exist in parts of Germany, including in a place we were at last year, a place called Erbach, where there is a Carolingian church. It's the oldest Romanesque church north of the Alps. Anyway, what happens in 843 is that Charlemagne's empire is divided into three parts at the Treaty of Verdun. And this is when you begin to see the emergence of, an area that we're going to call France and an area that we're going to call Germany. What ends up happening is that the middle part gets squeezed between the German and the French side. But the Carolingians really, even past this period, last for quite a while and create a relatively stable situation in France and in the areas of France, Germany, and northern Italy. But that, of course, breaks down in the 10th century, and you begin to see the emergence of more independent states and provinces and principalities, and they start fighting each other. And of course, there are the Viking invasions, which end up creating Normandy. But you still have this notion of the Holy Roman Empire. Otto the Great is crowned in 962, and of course, part of the thing is that emerges in this whole Holy Roman Empire is the relationship between the emperor and the pope. Who's in control? And as you can see, in 963, Otto the Great deposes one pope and replaces him with another. And in 987, you have the beginning of the Capet dynasty in France. In 989, the church tries to create what they call the peace and truce of God to stop the Christian states from fighting each other. That fails completely. And in the 11th century, the popes begin emerging as more of a power in their own right. For one thing, you see the final schism between the Eastern Church and the Western Church that divides the church formally into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. That's in 1054. Now, when Pope Gregory comes to the papal throne in 1067, he attempts to really define and push forward the power of the Pope, and this results in what is called the investiture controversy with the Emperor Henry IV. Okay? Where who gets to decide who appoints the emperor, the bishops, and it gets to the point where, Henry is excommunicated, and he ultimately has to capitulate. Okay? By the way, Pirandello wrote a very interesting play called Emperor Henry IV about a guy who thinks he's Emperor Henry IV. But anyway, and late in the 11th century, of course, Pope Urban issues the call for the Crusades. And for our purposes, that's going to be 1096 is going to be a very important date in the history of Ashkenaz and during the lifetime of Rashi himself. But Rashi only lives a little bit into the 12th century, so that's as far as we're going to go. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff happening, but I just want to give you the broad outlines of what's going on. Anybody have any questions at this particular point?
Been watching this Sunday night BBC program, Wolf Hall.
Oh yeah, well that's much later, yeah.
1500, I don't remember exactly.
Well, it's in the 16th century, yes.
Yes.
Old Henry VIII. Okay. So, before we look at some, I want to show you one thing that if you take a look at the last page. I'm sorry it didn't come out any clearer, but it comes from a much smaller image, and I had to blow it up, and I tried to sharpen it up. But one family that represents this whole shift from Italy into the Rhine is the Colonus family. The Colonus family are a family of Jewish, this is on page 8, are a family of Jewish scholars and liturgical poets. If you look especially in the traditional high holiday liturgy, you will see several of the most famous high holiday piyutim are written by Meshulam ben Colonimus or Colonimus ben Colonimus. In fact, the Natana Tokef is reputedly to have been written by a Colonimus, but it actually wasn't. There's a famous legend about him, and which is complete legend. Tana Tokef probably was written in southern Italy and during the time of the Byzantines. But the early members of the Colonimus family, the documentation for some of them is a little thin, but what we do know is, of course, the family name is Greek.
Yeah.
And in Greek, Kali Nomos means good name, which is a direct translation of the Hebrew name Shem Tov. So the family most likely started in the Byzantine South as a family of rabbis, scholars, poets, and we do know that they moved by the time of the Carolingians. They had moved into northern Italy. If you take a look, you'll see Meshulam the Great of Rome, or Lucca, in 967. We know that even before that, they were in Lucca. And from there, they moved into the Rhine. So in this one family, you see recapitulated the entire history of early Ashkenaz. Now, where does this family tree come from? And you see down at the bottom, and of course, this is only the early part of the family. There's the family, like, huge number of descendants. They are in Speyer, they're in Mainz, that's Mayence's Mainz. So they're in, like, the centers, founding centers of Ashkenaz. And we got this material because their descendants created these family trees. In around the 13th century, some of their descendants drew up this family tree, which has been, added to by scholars in the 19th century who were looking for documentary evidence of this family. But this recapitulates the whole thing. The traditional assumption is that Ashkenazic Jews started in a lot of them, started in southern Italy, moved into northern Italy, in the Carolingian period, or had by that point, and then from there moved into the Rhine, into level. And so the traditional view is that the main sort of cultural drift of Ashkenaz comes from Eretz Yisrael, because the Jews of southern Italy came originally from Eretz Yisrael. And this is opposed to Sfarad, the Jews of Spain, whose cultural influences come from before Spain, North Africa, before North Africa, from Babylon, so from the Babylonian Jewish tradition. That's a little simplistic. We know that, again, because the Ashkenazic Jews were involved with international trade, there were connections with Babylon as well. And Italy, of course, is a linchpin of all of this. Now, one other thing that's important to know about the relationship of Jews in Northern Europe to Christianity, which has a very important aspect on what will happen to them in subsequent centuries, as opposed to the Jews in Spain and the Jews in southern France, is that the Jews of Spain, southern France, and Italy were there since Roman times, and therefore had the status of Roman citizens. Okay? They were, so to speak, indigenous to the area. They'd been there for a very long time. And at a certain point in the 3rd century, one of the emperors had granted anybody who was an inhabitant of the Roman Empire Roman citizenship, which was a big deal. So the Jews of Italy and southern France and Spain were under the old Roman legal status, where, yes, it had an impact by later Christian stuff, but there was essentially a foundation of legal legitimacy, and they were not seen as outsiders. The difference is that the Jews in Ashkenaz, northern France, and so on, didn't have that, weren't seen in the same way. They were more recent. They were colonists. They didn't have the same foundational status. And this gave them a lot less legal security than the Jews in the South. So that's another important thing to remember. And while the early period that we're talking about, they were relatively secure, that began to decline in the late 12th and early 13th century, especially in the 13th century, which is why, starting in the 13th century, Jews were expelled from started to be expelled from the countries of Western Europe, starting with England, and then France, and then parts of Germany, and so on and so forth. So there was a very, very different legal status that happened. Anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, one area that has become quite interesting in the last few years is the genetic research into Ashkenaz. Okay, so if you take a look on page 5, there was an article that came out by Nicholas Wade on October the 8th of 2013 about the genetic roots of Ashkenaz. One of the Ashkenazic Jews have been one of the main populations that have been studied by geneticists because Ashkenazic Jews have a certain set of genetic markers which also causes certain very specific genetic diseases. Because the assumption was they were a relatively isolated population for a long time. Another population, by the way, they've done this with is they've practically done the entire genome of the population of Iceland. Recently came out, quite fascinating. So the Ashkenazim of Central and Eastern Europe, people wanted to see, this is kind of what you might call genetic archaeology. Can you trace the origins of people through genetic markers? They've done this, by the way, they've been able to distinguish between all kinds of interesting populations in England. They found some genetic material in some, prehistoric bones in England and found there are people living today who are descendants of that, So, you look what happened with Richard III, they were able to find a descendant of Richard III's sister, and they were able to get the genetics from his bones and from this guy, a Canadian guy, and found, so here, that's how they identified the bones.
Under the asphalt.
Exactly, and they just buried him in Leicester Cathedral with great pomp and circumstance. Okay, so they've done this with Ashkenazic Jews. And one of the things that had been established already is that Jewish populations, no matter where they are, have a common link in the Middle East. Surprise, surprise. Okay, that Jews all over the world have a common link in the Middle East going back a long time and are related to other Middle Eastern populations today. Doesn't surprise us, okay. But what's interesting is that when they did Ashkenaz, there is some suggestion that where you see this in the male DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the female line, shows European roots, which suggests that as Ashkenaz men moved to found these colonies, they married local women and converted them. And this seems to be what happened. So if you take a look on page 6, in 2006, they said that the foremost common mitochondrial DNA lineages amongst Ashkenazis came from the Near East, implying that just 4 Jewish women were the ancestors of nearly half of today's Ashkenazim, which would suggest that whole communities migrated. But they're now suggesting that in fact these 4 lineages form clusters within descent lines, this is the second last paragraph, that were established in Europe. So it seems very likely, if you go over to the next page, that it said about 2,000 years ago, and they're pointing it in Rome, which of course Rome, Jewish population, Rome was probably one of the places where Ashkenazic, Jews originally came from. And since Jews had lived in Rome for a long time, it would be perfectly not unusual that Jewish men would have taken Roman women as wives and converted them, and the descendants therefore would be traced back to that. Yeah.
We did some genetic testing in the family, and my husband's mother came up with one of these lineages, these four, back to, I thought, isn't that fantastic, since she was a blue-eyed, fair person, but she came out with one of those lineages is what you call it.
Yeah, it says 80% European origin for the Ashkenazic maternal lineages. It's quite fascinating, but it actually shows, proves what we know from the documentary evidence, that they moved north from Italy. What's interesting, if you look at the last paragraph, the second last paragraph states something which is one of these things that people have said for years. There's absolutely no proof of it, by the way, that 10% of the population of the Roman Empire were Jewish. That's just like, I have no historian would say that today. We just have no idea what the Jewish population of the Roman Empire was. But the fact is that in 1300 there were only about 25,000 Ashkenazim. And in 1300 they hadn't really moved into Eastern Europe yet. I mean, there was evidence for Jews in Poland as early as the year 1000, but not very many of them, and certainly no communities. But it's really in the 15th century that you begin to see Jews moving to what were the western provinces of Poland, and then from there further east. So, the big thing that people always want to know is, how come if there was all this small population, how come by the beginning of the 20th century, the vast majority of Jews were Ashkenazim, and where did all these people come from? I had a professor who claimed that it was the development of indoor mikvahs. But anyway, that did it. But, there was an old discredited theory that the Khazarian Jews of the Caspian Sea area were the descendants of Eastern European Jews were all descendants from the Khazars. But there's genetically absolutely no evidence, and even when the theory came out, it was discredited because there's no linguistic evidence. In other words, when you look at Yiddish as the language of Ashkenazic Jewry, you can trace actually through Yiddish, from the earliest Yiddish through to later Yiddish, where the Jews lived. Okay, in other words, the earliest level of Yiddish shows evidence of northern Italy, then it's Germanic, and then as it moves east, you get Slavonic words coming into it. There's not one single Khazarian word in Yiddish. Okay, Khazarian is a Turkish kind of ethnic group, and there's not a single bit of linguistic connection to Khazarian in Yiddish.
So what's the linguistic connection to northern Italy?
I'll get to that. I'll get into that next time. It's a dialect called La'az. And interestingly enough, Rashi sometimes he translates words into La'az, which seem to be in him early French. Rashi's a very interesting source of early medieval French, because he'll say this means that, and he'll give you the French word. Okay. So let's take a look at some documentary material. And the first thing I want to look at is something that comes from the time of Charlemagne, which gives you an example, of some of the rules, the legal rules that Jews were put under, and gives you some indication about some of the things they were doing. Again, most of our evidence from the time, we don't have any real documentation, Jewish documentation from this period. It's all government and church documentation, and there's a little bit of archaeological stuff, but very little. So, Suzanne, you want to start reading on page 3, and number 7?
Okay, Charlemagne, Capitulary for the Jews, 814. Let no Jew presume to take in pledge or for any debt any of the goods of the church in gold, silver, or other form from any Christian. But if he presume to do so, which God forbid, let all his goods be seized and let his right hand be cut off. Let no Jew presume to take any Christian in pledge for any Jew or Christian, nor let him do anything worse. But if he presume to do so, let him make reparation according to his law, and at the same time he shall lose both pledge and debt.
So what's going on here?
Sounds like slavery.
Debts, of course, people had to have, sureties, right? And so what does this mean? Jews were involved in trade and loaning of money. Like, this is, well, it's not loaning money here. It's, giving people goods on credit. Yes, exactly. Credit as long established in the world by this time. And so you've got to give something as surety, right? So what does it mean, goods of the church?
Artifacts, the gold and the silver. And
Crosses, yeah, exactly. I mean, none of the church ritual objects, Jews cannot hold those in pledge.
Candlesticks.
Right, exactly. So, in gold, silver, from any Christian, and pretty severe punishment for that.
Can they tell where it came from?
What?
How would they know where it came
Oh,
from?
everybody would know. I mean, look, don't forget, the churchmen, bishops, and other people, they were buying stuff on credit like anybody else. So what did they have to give in pledge? The actual artifacts from the church itself.
And there probably wasn't a whole lot of that stuff floating around, that you could tell came from the church.
But what this in effect says is that Christians who could do this, but it was not considered right for Jews to do it. All right, and the second one is taking a person
In pledge.
in pledge. Okay,
Indentured servitude.
or a slave.
Slavery.
Yes, slave.
There were slaves in this period of time, and there were most of the slaves were Slavs from the east, captured in war. There were pagans, and there was this real issue that long before this Jews are buying slaves. First of all, they weren't allowed to have Christian slaves. But if they even got a pagan slave, the church people were really upset that the Jews were converting them to Judaism, which is what the Jewish tradition said you're supposed to do. By the way, this was happening all the time, and we actually know that there were Jews in later Jews who were descendant of these slaves converts, and we know in documentation from the Middle East later than this in the Cairo Geniza of slaves who during the time of being slaves with their masters, servants would make enough money on their own to go into partnership with their masters, and sometimes when they got freed at a certain point, they continued as business partners. I mean, so this was quite common that was going on because most slaves in this time were people who were captured in warfare.
Is that where the Morano come from?
No, that's much later. So the point is that this is something that the issue of the relationship of Jews to the slaves that they owned was of great concern to the church authorities. They did not, and of course this was true also in Muslim countries, Jews could not have a Muslim slave because Jews were not supposed to have power over Christians.
Right.
Because part and parcel of the underlying Christian theology that evolved was the notion that the subjugation of the Jews is proof of their of the truth of Christianity, right? That as long as Jews are a subject people, and this comes from St. Augustine and others, this is proof of the victory of the church. And at some point I'll show you maybe next time pictures of statuary that is found on churches and in stained glass windows from a fairly early period. I think maybe Gothic as early as, I don't know what the earliest date is, where you see the church as a woman triumphant and the synagogue as a woman blindfolded and defeated. So the images of the church and the synagogue became very common as icons. And by the way, that was one of the reasons why it took the Vatican so long to recognize the State of Israel, because recognizing the State of Israel is recognizing the sovereignty of the Jews again, which it contradicts that whole idea. And it's to the credit of John Paul II that he finally got the Vatican to recognize the State of Israel. All right, you want to read a little further, number 3?
Let no Jew presume to have a money changer's table in his house, nor shall he presume to sell wine, grain, or other commodities there. But if it be discovered that he has done so, all his goods shall be taken away from him, and he shall be imprisoned until he is brought into our presence.
Now, why do you think they don't want them doing business in their houses? Because, I mean, people had market days, okay, and
Not
people
transparent.
could be evading taxes. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to understand, trade in those days was extremely restricted in terms of when people could have trade. When there were very specific market days where people could sell and buy, and other days you couldn't. So evidently, they wanted to make sure. I think it has to do with taxes, because these things were trade was always taxed, in some cases pretty heavily, and just because it mentions money changers here, don't assume that Jews are money lenders at this period of time to any great extent. They may have been, but it was not really what their chief occupation was. That comes much later. So, all right, let's look at number 4.
Concerning the oath of the Jews against the Christians, place sorrel twice around his body from head to feet. He ought to stand when he takes his oath, and he should have in his right hand the 5 books of Moses according to his law. And if he cannot have them in Hebrew, he shall have them in Latin. Quote, may the God who gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai help me, and may the leprosy of Naaman the Syrian come upon me as it came upon him, and may the earth swallow me as it swallowed Dathan and Abiram. I have not committed evil against you in this cause.
This is really interesting. Remembering that in the Germanic non-literate areas, the public oath is of incredible importance in court cases. So you had to swear an oath. So Christians, of course, would swear an oath on something holy to the Christians, and undoubtedly the deprecation that comes with an oath, namely if I'm telling a lie, all these horrible things come on him. What's fascinating here is what there's a court case between because court cases between Jews were probably handled by Jews themselves. But in a case where a Jew had a claim against a Christian and had to go to court for it, well, what kind of oath are you going to do it? And it's really interesting, the form of the oath that they're supposed to take. First of all, they're supposed to hold the Torah. But if they can't have the Torah, they can have the Latin translation, the Vulgate. And notice what he's supposed to say. Naaman the Syrian, that is the story. There's a famous story about a Syrian general in the Bible who has leprosy, and he comes and Elijah cures him of his leprosy. And of course, Dathan and Abiram, who are they? They're part of the followers of Korah, who get swallowed up by the earth in the book of Numbers. So taking 2 good examples out of the Hebrew Bible, may I be stricken with leprosy or swallowed up by the earth if I am lying.
What is sorrow?
And the sorrel, well, it's green.
It's a plant, yeah.
It's a plant.
It's a kind of grass.
Yeah, I have no idea.
That shove with sorrel.
Is that buried in it?
No, it just says wound twice around his body from it. I have no idea what this is. This is some kind of, I don't know, superstitious magical thing. I'm sorry for not looking it up, but
I can't lie of sorrel wrapped around.
It would be interesting.
Torah while he has all this stuff wrapped
It would be interesting to know if the Christians also had to have this, and I'm sorry I didn't look it up. I'll go look it up. It looks quite fascinating. I mean, sorrel, obviously, there must be some kind of curse thing connected with it. Maybe it'll squeeze you to death or something like that. There's got to be some kind of magical element to it. Otherwise, there's no reason for it. Okay, so this is some of the examples of how Jews had to, given their their economic activity, had to, things are going to come to court. I mean, these things are going to happen. And how do you negotiate between the relationships between Christians and Jews? Where in legal affairs, and you've got the church, with its already long tradition of pushing against the Jews having any way of any control or power. And on the other hand, Charlemagne's rule is actually very tolerant of the Jews And we have stories from various annals of the history of the rule of Charlemagne where he's using Jews on diplomatic missions. And there's a rather amusing I don't know, actually this probably really happened, story about how there was a bishop who was a great collector of rare artifacts and things, and Charlemagne decided this guy needed to be taken down a peg, and so he had this Jewish guy take a mouse and stuff the mouse with spices and things, and put it in a box, a dead mouse. And the Jew who was a friend of Charlemagne's, evidently used him for various stuff he wanted to buy, had him go to this bishop and tell this bishop this was an exceedingly rare animal. And this whole story about how the bishop negotiates with the merchant. He offers him £1 and the merchant says, "You got to be kidding, this is a rare animal," and till he ends up paying him like £100, some enormous amount of money for this thing. And when the bishop brings this thing to the emperor, showing him how proud he is as he's acquired this, the emperor sort of mocks him and say, say you bought a dead mouse, essentially. And this is written in the annals of the history of Charlemagne, because we actually have several accounts of the life of Charlemagne written. Some of it written right after his death, by the way. A guy named Erhard, and every once in a while there's Jewish people, Jews mentioned in it. Sometime by name, by the way. Not a lot of references, but a few. So we know that the court of Charlemagne and his later descendants, through the time, the Jews were in a fairly secure position, were actively involved in a sophisticated trade, and were beginning to found permanent settlements. And at some point, they are also beginning to create schools of Talmudic learning in the Rhine. Some of that the origin of that's a little mysterious, but it goes back several generations before Rashi, although we don't have contemporary documentation about it. What happens is that in the 11th century, when the cities are beginning to rise, and you're beginning to shift into this literate culture, you begin, and you had the breakup of the Carolingian Empire, which means a lot of insecurity now, as different principalities and states are now fighting each other for control. You begin to see the rise of formal charters of settlement by local rulers for Jewish communities. So one of our earliest examples of this is from 1084, and is from a guy named Rudiger, who is the Bishop of Speyer. Now, Speyer is one of the three early communities of Ashkenaz. The communities of Speyer, Mainz, and Worms are called the Shum communities, because you take Speyer and Worms and Mainz, and it ends up with the Hebrew word Shum, which means garlic, by the way. And there are, we'll look at them next time, there are actual community ordinances that are called the Shum Takanot. In other words, community ordinances that governed all three communities. What's interesting about Speyer's Worms and Mainz is they are cathedral towns with cathedral schools. So it's quite interesting that in centers of what was becoming now the literate culture, centers of the literate culture around the cathedrals of the bishops, and these were, by the way, church-ruled towns. This is a time where certain cities were controlled by the bishop, as opposed to a temporal ruler, and usually the land around the town. You begin to see the development of the yeshivot in these very same places, which are the beginning of the Jewish literate culture. Jackie, you had a question?
Yeah, well, no, it just seems to me that these were the areas of largest settlements where most trade would go on, It would seem very likely that that's what would attract people.
Absolutely, and of course the Rhine was a major highway of trade from all the way from the North Sea and from, you know, the what we call the Low Countries and Scandinavia and England, you know, into right up into central Germany. And of course it was the border of the Roman Empire, so there are these old settlement cities that originally began as the military headquarters of the Roman legions, like Frankfurt and Cologne, because the Rhine was, in the later part of the Roman Empire, was the border. So there's long, long establishment, and Christianity, by the way, this is some of the earliest areas of Christianity in the German-speaking areas as well. So these are very, very old cities already, important, and they are now growing in the 11th century.
If you were to visit one of these, three of these towns, would you see remnants of Jewish civilization?
In Worms, there actually is the remnants of what's called the Rashi Synagogue, which was rebuilt a couple of times. There's been some archaeological stuff that has been found, but because of various things that happened over the many centuries since, very, very little remains from this period of time. I'll see if I can find some pictures of some stuff, you know, little stones here and there. One of the most remarkable finds that actually that happened was in Normandy about 30 years ago, maybe even more than 30 years ago. The center of Normandy is the city of Rouen, and there was a Jewish community for there quite early on, and the Jews of England probably almost all came from Rouen, by the way. And when I was in college, it had been the theory of a Jewish scholar that Rouen must have had a yeshiva, must have had a Jewish school, and he deduced it from documentation as well. There was a map that existed from the 16th century of Rouen, which showed a building that was listed as the Jews' school, even though there was no Jew living in Rouen at the time. That apparently some building had lasted. So this scholar had written this whole book about this, trying to reconstruct the medieval Jewish community of Rouen, is why it was important. Part of the problem that people hadn't really done it before is that the name, as written in Hebrew manuscripts, didn't look like Rouen, so it was Rhodos or something, and people didn't know what it was. And then right after he published the book, they were doing some excavations in the big public square in front of the courts, the old courthouse in Rouen, and a bulldozer fell through the pavement, and underneath they found the yeshiva.
Wow.
They know it's not a synagogue, and they found underground the remnants, the foundations of this medieval yeshiva, and they could tell also because of the graffiti they found on the walls. So apparently, and I've never been there myself, it's one of those things I'd like to do, is there you can now go down and look at it. But it's one of the only medieval Jewish buildings in Western Europe that still survives, and purely survived by accident. So let's, in the time remaining, we do have a few more minutes. Let's take a look at this grant by the Bishop of Speyer, Rudiger. This is a very famous one from 1084. Apparently what happened was there had been some kind of pogrom in one of the other towns, and a bunch of Jews left and wanted to sort of settle in Speyer, even though there had been a community there. He decides it's a good idea to have a Jewish community in Speyer, and so this is the charter that he sets up that sets out the terms by which the Jews live in Speyer, and it's really quite interesting. Muriel, do you want to start reading?
In the name of the Holy and Indivisible Trinity, I, Rudiger, surnamed Uzaman, Bishop of Speyer. When I made the villa of Speyer into a town, thought I would increase the honor I was bestowing on the place if I brought in the Jews.
This is really interesting.
Wow.
He wants to, for him to turn this place into a really great city, he's got to bring in Jews. Go on.
Therefore, I placed them outside the town and some way off from the houses of the rest of the citizens, unless they should be easily disturbed by the insolence of the citizens. So there was anti-Semitism.
It's quite different in his belief from the citizens.
Wait, go on.
I surrounded them with a wall.
Now, this is really interesting. He creates a Jewish quarter. This is not a ghetto. He creates a Jewish neighborhood, and walls are incredibly expensive, which is why medieval towns tended to be fairly small. But he adds on to the town by creating a Jewish neighborhood where he surrounds it with the defensive wall. Go on.
Now the place of their habitation, which I acquired justly, for in the first place I obtained the hill partly with money and partly by exchange, while I received the valley by way of gift from some heirs.
So he's telling you how he financed all of this.
Right. That place, I say, I transferred to them on condition that they pay annually 3.5 pounds of the money of spire for the use of the brethren.
To the church. Okay, they have to pay rent of 3.5 pounds. I can't tell you whether that's a lot or not. Go on.
I have granted also to them within the district where they dwell, and from the district outside the town, as far as the harbor, and within the harbor itself.
Because Speier's on the Rhine.
Right. Full power to change gold and silver and to buy and sell what they please.
In other words, complete freedom of economic activity.
Mm-hmm. And I have also given them license to do this throughout the state.
Because Speier's not just a town, it's a city-state. And the bishop is the temporal ruler of Speyer. Go on.
Besides this, I have given to them the land of the church for a cemetery with rights of inheritance.
In other words, he gave them a piece of land that he owned for a cemetery, which is, of course, what Jews want. Like, one of the first things they want is, before they need to have a synagogue, they need to have a cemetery. Go on.
This also I have added, that if any Jew should at any time stay within them, he shall pay no
Felony, which is a kind of, occupation, fee. Meaning if some Jew comes from the outside, a merchant comes in, he doesn't have to pay a special fee, which is a great concession, by the way. Go on.
Then also, just as the judge of the city hears cases between citizens, so the chief rabbi shall hear cases which arise between the Jews or against them.
Meaning they have their own internal court system. This, by the way, is not unusual for the medieval period for different groups. In the medieval period, you had groups. There was rarely what we would call an overall judicial system for everybody. What you had were different kinds of courts for different communities, what are known as universitas. Okay, so church people were tried by church courts. The secular people were tried by the secular courts. And so it was the universities, the students had their own courts. In other words, everybody was like a state within a state, essentially. And so this is not an unusual thing. They are a community, a università, within the larger community, so they have their own courts. And so internal affairs are covered by their own courts. Go on.
They shall maintain watches, guards, and fortifications about their district. The guards in common.
Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, you missed a sentence. But if by chance.
Oh, but if by chance he is unable to decide, any of them shall go to the bishop or his chamber.
There's a right of appeal. So the bishop could have the final say if the Jewish courts can't settle a case amongst themselves. Go on.
They shall maintain watches, guards, and fortifications about their district, the guards in common with our vassals.
Notice this, they're responsible for defending their part of the wall of the town, meaning they have to have their own police force and their own armed guards. So Jews were carrying weapons. Go on.
They may lawfully employ nurses and servants from among our people.
That's a very important point, because there were other places and other times where Jews, that right was not necessarily protected. But it was very common in the Middle Ages for Jews to have Christian servants and nursemaids and all this kind of stuff. This is not unusual. And it shows up in Jewish legal material about conflicts and problems and things of that sort. Go on.
Slaughtered meat, which they may not eat according to their law, they may lawfully sell to Christians, and Christians may lawfully buy it.
Okay, so in other words, when they slaughter an animal, if it's treif according to Jewish tradition, because when they open up the animal, if they find certain blemishes on the lungs, they can't eat it, but they can sell it to Christians for whom it is permitted. Now, again, some cases this is an area of conflict, right? where where Christian authorities say, "Oh, you're not good enough for you. Why should we? Why should you be able to sell it to us?" But this, of course, is an important economic thing for the Jews, because if they can't sell the treif meat, and of course the treif meat doesn't mean it's not edible, it's just ritually not permitted. If they had to lose that, that's a huge economic loss. So this is a very important concession. Go on.
Finally, to round out these concessions, I have granted that they may enjoy the same privileges as Jews in the other cities of Germany.
Any other city in Germany, meaning that if not covered under here, the Jews in Mainz and in Worms and in other places may have certain kinds of privileges. You guys have the same thing.
They won't be undersold.
Exactly. Go on. Last, this is important, by the way. Go on.
Lest any of my successors diminish this gift and concession, or constrain them to pay greater taxes, alleging that they have usurped these privileges and have no episcopal warrant for them, I have left this charter as a suitable testimony of the said grant. And this may never be forgotten. I have signed it and confirmed it with my seal, and may be seen below. Given on September 15th, 1083.
And we actually have this document, okay? And so what he's saying is, I wrote it down so nobody could question it. And this shows you the shift to the literate culture. What now becomes legitimate is what is written. And this kind of charter is very common in this period of time. And notice what it allows. Freedom of trade, right? Certain rights and privileges and responsibilities of settlement, the Jewish community basically running its own internal affairs, and the bishop is, of course, extending his protection over them. Now, only 12 years later, this is not going to help them during the First Crusade. I don't think Speyer was one of the towns that got attacked. I don't remember. But the point is, there's going to be a situation where the bishops are going to try and stop the Jews from being attacked, and it just becomes impossible for them. They can't. All right, so here we are. I hope you get a good picture now, an overall picture of where Ashkenazic Jews come from, and the fact that by the time that Rashi is born, there is a long settlement of Ashkenazic Jews in the Rhine Valley. They've already, as you will see next week, established schools, yeshivot, and so there's already a long-established intellectual group. Rashi, of course, comes from an area. It comes from Troyes, which is the capital of Champagne. But the point is, the Rhineland, the Shum communities are the spiritual heartland of Ashkenazic Jewry. And that he's born into a time when there's this transition, the growth of cities, the breakup, the old empire is broken up, the emergence of these different competing city-states and other things. But already there's this long Ashkenazic settlement in this area, hundreds of years already. And even if they were small communities, and we don't have very much documentation from them themselves, we know a fair bit about what's going on.